Okay, so hello everybody. As I already said just a couple of seconds ago, this is a bit of an overview today. So I'm looking at the literature of ghouls and ghosts, a history of the Gothic. It's a little bit of a misleading title because one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is the way in which the Gothic is not simply about ghouls and ghosts. It's not simply a literature of the supernatural, but in part investigating how important that sort of the possibility of the supernatural is to the Gothic quite frequently. That's my Twitter handle, the hashtag as usual, feel free to use them now or during the week as well to contact other people in the group or to talk to me. Let me give you an idea of what I'm going to be doing today and where the limits of it are a little bit. So as usual, there's going to be 3 sections. As usual, there's going to be more concentration on my area of expertise, which, if you've not been before, is the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But this is a survey today. So the first section, the longest section, is going to be the late 18th, early 19th century, the early British Gothic. The second section, roughly speaking, is going to be the Victorian period. And the last section is going to be looking very briefly at some of the ways in which the Gothic manifests in the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, what I'm not even pretending to do at all is to cover every single aspect and iteration of the Gothic. It would be completely impossible. And that's also why the section on the 20th century is one of the shortest, because by the 20th century, we're seeing so many different proliferations of ways in which the Gothic manifests and what it's influenced, and different genres that are integrated with the Gothic to some extent or use the Gothic mode. I'm also very much concentrating really on the British tradition. I'm looking at some overlap with other national traditions and with the American tradition, but really concentrating on the British tradition in order to give us that sort of slightly narrower focus. We do have people, guest lecturers, who are going to be talking about different national traditions. We've definitely got an American Gothic speaker coming. We've got 2 speakers on different aspects of Mexican Gothic. And we have hopefully somebody coming to talk about Southeast Asian Gothic. But if you have an expertise in another tradition, then do get in contact with me. I'm still like trying to set up Sunday Gothics and stuff so that we can get that wide view. Anyway, having said all of that, let's get started with this sort of introduction to the Gothic and the history of the Gothic. So before I get into the history, first of all, what do we mean by the Gothic? I think that's one of the big questions. And sort of doing a PhD in Gothic and Gothic theology, this was something I definitely came across, you know, the classic question, what are you doing a PhD in? Oh, the Gothic, what's that? And people have certain understandings and expectations of what the Gothic is. And none of these, I would say, are wrong, but they are often quite limited, and they can shut down our understanding of the width of the Gothic to some extent. So one of the first things that comes to mind for people is goth subculture. I know that this is true because when I started my PhD, I had a really large percentage of people who expected me suddenly to become sort of culturally very Gothic and to start dressing very snappily. And it did not work out for them. Still dressed like me. I also had people that very much misunderstood goth subculture and thought I was going to end up worshipping the devil as well, which is a very bizarre end of interpreting my PhD, I think. But certainly goth subculture borrows from these Gothic literary roots, these Gothic aesthetic roots, but it's only one of many manifestations, of course. Another way of thinking about the Gothic that quite a lot of people have is through this idea of an aesthetic, often of a sort of chiaroscuro, this world of shadows, obscurity, with these moments of light. I think this is, you know, this is an image which sums up a couple of the ideas that we have often about the Gothic and how it looks, how it manifests. Also, that can be connected with some ideas maybe about the thematics of the Gothic, an interest in death, in the supernatural, in the liminal. For a particular type of person, when I say that I'm studying the Gothic, they go, oh yes, the architecture. Yes. And of course, there is quite a lot of overlap and link between the Gothic revival that you're seeing in 18th and 19th centuries and the rise of the Gothic. The picture on the left is obviously a picture of Strawberry Hill, which is the Gothic confection, which Walpole had built and partly designed himself in the 18th century. So Horace Walpole, of course, was the first Gothic writer. And he also was an antiquarian, very, very interested in the medieval. And obviously in the 18th century, Gothic at times was a catch-all word for the medieval. And he created this Gothic revival house at the same time as creating or helping to create Gothic literature. So there's certainly a lot of overlap there in what the same point of interest, similar foundations. And we see as well that sort of leading on, obviously, in the 19th century, in the Gothic revival that we see, for example, in the Houses of Parliament. And this continued interest with a Gothic past, both as a barbarous past and as a reclaimed past. I can talk about that quite a lot. There's a lot of study about how the term Gothic was understood in the 18th century and how that manifested in both architecture and literature. But there's always this tension around how we understand it, this interest in the medieval that both sort of pushes it away and tries to absorb from it this sense of a long-standing British history of democracy, for example. So another thing that people quite often think about with the Gothic is a quite a narrow selection of Gothic texts. I found this quite a lot, particularly when I do school visits, and I will sometimes get corrected by students about my understanding of the Gothic, based on really these three novels. I think when people think of the Gothic, these are the things that quite often come up: Frankenstein, Dracula, and Jekyll and Hyde. And of course, I've chosen some of the classiest covers I could find there for you to demonstrate these titles. But while all these titles are very clearly Gothic, they are also coming from, all of them obviously, from the 19th century. And it is a particular type of Gothic that we find in them, which is often doesn't have that much in common with a lot of the things that I study, for example, in the 18th century, or with some of the more modern iterations. So if we have this as this is what the Gothic is, it can limit our understanding, and it can also sort of conflate the Gothic with a sort of dark neo-Victorianism as well, which is quite narrowing it down too much, obviously. We find this similarly in how people sometimes address Gothic in films. Now, I'm not trying to erase a definition within sort of film studies and horror studies between the Gothic and horror, but these two films are obviously very clearly Gothic horror, Gothic films, which rely on a visual language relating back to that sort of sense of the Victorian Gothic almost. But these are not the only interactions, quite clearly, between the Gothic and horror film, or the Gothic and film. So if we limit ourselves to this particular visual conception, then we are narrowing down the Gothic beyond what we should, arguably. So this is the interaction part, and some of you have already done this on Twitter. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. In order to show some of the kind of range of the Gothic, I have put this little mini quiz up. There are 15 pictures from 15 different works of Gothic fiction. And I want you to write down in the comments, in the chat, how many you think you can get. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do it. And then I'll go through the answers and you can check yourself. There's no shame if you get only one. Some of the pictures I've picked are deliberately difficult. Couple of people answering, awesome. I don't know, you'll have to tell me in the break because I can't see the chat while I'm doing it. I tried this morning, but you'll have to tell me in the break if any of you got the 15 and were correct about them all. So let's start from the top left-hand corner. When everyone's ready, I'll wait for it to stop flashing before I start. Okay, you don't have to stop. That was just me being like, I want to give everyone their chance. So from the top, we've got The Monk by Matthew Lewis, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, second row from the left, Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, Nosferatu, I'll also accept Dracula, The Call of Cthulhu or any of the Cthulhu mythos from Lovecraft, A Picture of Dorian Gray, of course, by Oscar Wilde, To Kill a Mockingbird, an example of the Southern Gothic there, by Harper Lee, The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle, The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, Gaywick by Vincent Verga, oh my gosh, what is it called? Bloodborne. I almost said Blood Rain, not the same. And of course, Hannibal. So I hope that somebody got the 15. I'm going to put it onto the next screen, and now nobody's got all 15 for this screen yet, so that's the challenge for you. Another range here. This is the second and the last. Again, 30 seconds, maybe a couple more. See how many of these can you get, do you think? I think nobody has yet guessed at all on Twitter or anywhere the very middle picture. It's not just any old woman running away from a house. Okay. Just watching the number go up. I love that you're participating. Thank you very much. I hope you are. I mean, you could all be saying, what is she doing? Okay, so I'll give it a couple more seconds. Did anyone get 15? You'll have to tell me in the chat in the middle of the break. I'm excited. So from the top, we have The Mysteries of Udolpho, Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. I will also accept Christabel because I have used this illustration for Christabel before. The Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, Bleak Expectations by Charles Dickens, Dracula by Bram Stoker, second row down, Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Beloved by Toni Morrison, dun dun dun, Mistress of Mellon by Victoria Holt. If anyone got that, kudos. Rebecca, obviously, by Daphne du Maurier, The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, Twilight, see me slipping it in there, the Sunday text, The Land of Darkness, which is from the Evil Dead series. I love that poster. It's amazing. The Grudge, The Shape of Water, and Crimson Peak. So hopefully what you will see here is some of the range of the way in which the Gothic has manifested over time. And we're trying to include all of these aspects. Now, I'm not saying, for example, that a film like Land of Darkness is just Gothic. I want to move away from sort of just putting a Gothic stamp on it. It's ours now. It's in our genre. Bye-bye, everyone else. No, what I'm going to be doing today is sort of tracing the way in which the Gothic has developed, it has influenced, it has infected, and the way we can see sort of aspects of the Gothic and interactions with the Gothic mode through a lot of different media, texts, etc. over time. So I've said that I don't want to provide a very narrow definition, and I don't really want to provide any definition at all of the Gothic. You have to take it as read that I have done all the reading. Presumably you can. I did my PhD in Gothic studies. So there are lots and lots of different definitions of the Gothic from different scholars. I think all of them are useful. All of them have things to contribute to the debate. But I'm always wary of going with a single definition because it tends to exclude. And it also tends to narrow down the field of inquiry. And I'll talk about how that manifests or what I mean by that in a second. But let's put forward some ideas of how we can be thinking about the Gothic and how we can interrogate it. So I've called it a literature of ghouls and ghosts in the title, a literature of spooks and spectres. And I think it's very legitimate to notice or to note the way in which Gothic texts are often engaged with an exploration of the supernatural. Now, this may result in an end verdict of, yes, the supernatural is real. We're haunted right now. There's a monster in the closet. But it might also result in an explained supernatural, where that noise wasn't really a ghost. It was my mum locked in the cellar, as we've talked about before. So what for me is a slightly more useful term and a little bit less narrow in thinking about this, is of thinking about the Gothic as a literature of uncertainty, where we're called upon to question the rules that we understand to be controlling or defining our world. Now, those could be questions about the border between the supernatural and the natural, between the real and the unreal, madness and sanity. It could simply be being forced to reassess and re-understand our entire worldview. So for me, that sort of idea of the Gothic as a literature of uncertainty is a little bit more inclusive. One of the most common features of Gothic discussion is this emphasis on it as a literature of fear and terror. And there's been some great scholars picking this apart. Catherine Spooner, for example, Avril Horner and Suze Losnick. And I think, obviously, fear and terror are often common features of the Gothic. But if we focus too hard on them, we end up excluding whole fields of the Gothic. It's always been funny to me because a lot of the books that I read from the 18th century are about as terrifying as like a cup of tea. Most of them are hilarious. And so for me, it's not a literature of fear and terror, even though those are investigated in the texts. But what we do find, I would say, in these texts being explored is the line between fear and desire. In the Gothic, there's always something that is desired, and it could be in a sort of antagonistic relationship with what is feared, or they could be found in the same object, the same site, where fear and desire are terrifyingly mixed, such as in the figure of the vampire. But if we ignore that sort of the importance of desire, and I'm not just talking about sexual desire here, but the importance of desire to the genre, that's how we end up with the situation we have now, where Gothic romance, for example, despite being arguably the most popular version of the Gothic in the 20th century, can be referred to by Gothic scholars as a niche subgenre. But when we prioritize fear and terror, we often ignore some of these other manifestations of the Gothic, such as the Gothic romance, the paranormal romance, the comic Gothic, the parody, that kind of thing. We can think of it as a literature of nightmares. More broadly, I think thinking of it as an oneric mode, a mode that is often dreamlike, engaged with a form of sort of dream logic and investigation of fear, desire, transgression, liminal spaces, which functions quite often in the manner of a dream. Now, a number of definitions, such as the Chris Baldick definition in the Oxford Book of Gothic Tales, which is a very popular one, often define the Gothic by themes. Again, these are useful, but let's not universalize them. One of the common themes of the Gothic is a sense of claustrophobia and containment, both metaphorically, particularly in relation to women and the home, and also literally, there's a lot of imprisonment in the Gothic, a lot of small cells and inquisitional chambers. But as our Australian friends pointed out this morning, that's actually the opposite of what you get in the Australian Gothic, which is usually a Gothic of open spaces and the terror of that unknown open space. So let's not universalize it. There's often an interest in inheritance, both at the quite literal level, where there's a lot of tales of usurpation fought over inheritances, but also at that metaphorical level, inheritance from the past which can't be escaped. And there's often an investigation within the Gothic of this idea of the tyranny of the past, a past which continues to dominate and infect the present. So often Gothic texts, particularly from that early period, are seen as setting back their action in time as a sort of distancing motif, where they can investigate some of the problems and issues of the day by throwing them back into the past. But what happens then is, of course, that we find that the past is something which hasn't died at all. The things we want to think of as this past barbarism have their reflections in our modern society as well. As I've said before, fear and terror don't feel like very effective labels to me, particularly for the books I read, but threat does. Gothic novels are usually a novel of threat, where the characters experience a threat to themselves, to their identity, and to their worldview, which might not cause any fear in us now, but probably did in the beginning. Of course, if we're talking about the Gothic, we can't not talk about the liminal, that investigation of the in-between space, the threshold between life and death, between the real and the unreal. These often transgressive spaces. The Gothic is often a genre which deals with transgression in the sense of moral transgression, for example, but also transgression in terms of transgressing borders and binaries, investigating and breaking through those boundaries. So, for example, we often think of life and death as opposites, but the Gothic transgresses that boundary, transgresses that line in figures such as the vampire. The final sort of category that I'm going to briefly chat about is the idea of defining the Gothic by aesthetic. Now, I'm not talking about, we're doing a checklist of lighting and, are there enough crypts? Are there enough crenellations? But there's certainly a sense that the Gothic is frequently, but not always, again, let's not universalize, engaged in particularly interaction with a number of different aesthetics. One of which is, of course, the uncanny, which is often linked to Freud's essay on the uncanny, but in very basic terms, this sense of a confrontation with the unfamiliar, which is horrifyingly familiar, that uncanny valley often as well. So mannequins are always a good example of the uncanny, something which is so alike, but so alien. The unhomely in the homely. The other one is the sublime, and as I say all the time, let's not just talk about Burke. If you've studied the 18th century only sort of briefly, you will definitely have been taught about Burke. But he's one of a number of theoreticians of the sublime. But at the broadest level, the sublime is a confrontation with that which is beyond, that which transcends, that which is beyond our understanding and the material plane usually. And so the sublime is an experience of that space where we're both transported and experience something of transcendence, but also the crushing realization of our own minusculeness in the face of this enormity, in the face of this transcendence. So, brief whistle-stop tour there of some of the ways in which we can think of the Gothic, and be bearing these in mind as I'm talking. But what I'm going to do today is try to map out something of a history of the Gothic. So starting from the Gothic, which self-defined as the Gothic in the 18th century, and seeing how it developed and diversified and grew throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries. There's going to be so many book recommendations today, by the way, but don't worry, I have a 5-page bibliography for you. So don't feel like you have to scribble them all down. Okay, if we're going to do a history of the Gothic, you know where this is going. Castle of Otranto. I feel like every class has to have Castle of Otranto at this point. I won't go into it in great detail because we've talked about it a lot if you've been at my previous classes. Now, there is some debate and contention about what the first Gothic novel is, but we're starting with Castle of Otranto because it's the first to call itself a Gothic story. It's a sort of quite clear starting point for the self-creation of a genre known as the Gothic. As you will know by now, the basic story is that of the tyrant Manfred. He's trying to avoid the family curse, which is all about the fact that his grandfather usurped the kingdom from somebody else. He's trying to do this by marrying into the line of true heirs. When his son is crushed by a giant helmet out of the sky, he decides that it's his job to marry Isabella, who he thinks is the true heir. Various shenanigans ensue, including many examples of the supernatural. And we also have the true heir appears in the guise of a peasant, but we find out later that he is truly noble. It's set in the medieval period and ends really quite badly. It's meant to be a closed ending where, the usurper is cast out, but we just end up with everybody a bit dead and nobody's happy. So what we find in the Castle of Otranto, and we'll talk about this in a second, is a theorization of what the Gothic is trying to do, but we also find a number of the tropes which are going to be quite frequently found in the early British Gothic. So the first thing to note is this idea of the found manuscript. So Castle of Otranto was originally published by Walpole in the first edition as a translation of a medieval manuscript which had purportedly been found in a library, a Catholic library, in the north of England. North of England as well. Barbarous place. Obviously, in the second edition is when he came clean, telling us that this was not the translation of a medieval monk's work, and there was quite a lot of kickback because of it. But this technique of the found manuscript is one that we'll continue to find throughout the Gothic as a fairly common technique. He also introduces, of course, the Mediterranean setting, which again is quite frequent within the early British Gothic. But I see a lot of critical work that says they're all in Europe, they're all in Southern Europe. But that ignores quite a lot of Gothic texts from the period. What I think was fair to say is that Mediterranean settings such as Italy, Spain, and Greece were quite common, but we also have generally these settings in othered locations which are seen to be different, barbarous, Gothic, basically. And these often include the outlying places in the United Kingdom, such as Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and of course, Yorkshire. A Catholic setting is found here, and that is something that we will quite commonly come across within Gothic texts. Often there is a confrontation with Catholic superstition or a confrontation with Catholic modes of church organization, which are seen to be perfidious, inquisitions and monasteries which are part trap, part sanctuary. Of course, we see this interest in the supernatural, and what Walpole was doing in this text was sort of reclaiming the supernatural as a legitimate feature of prose fiction. Now, we don't see the same sort of supernatural for a couple of decades, really, after Walpole. It gets toned down, as we're going to see, but he does have this defense and introduction of the supernatural. We have, of course, the heroine in peril motif, which will be such a feature of the early British Gothic. A returning past that you can't escape in this text that takes the form of the family curse. Comic servants, one of his innovations, which is the most irritating, I think, as a reader. This idea of the servant as garrulous, usually quite stupid, quite superstitious, that acts as a foil for the noble hero. And also we find within it a theological critique. If you've been to any of my other classes, I've gone into this at length, so I'm not going to do it today. But what I think is quite interesting is the way in which the Castle of Otranto, right from the beginning, shows the ways in which the Gothic is often a mode which is used to critique and engage with theology. In this case, it's a critique of providential theologies and original sin. So what was he trying to do? You'll know this if you've been to other classes, but he was attempting to blend two kinds of romance. The ancient, by which is meant the medieval romance, such as the Arthurian legends, and the modern novels, such as Tom Jones or Pamela. In the former, those romances, always imagination and improbability. In the latter, nature is always intended to be copied with success. So what he was trying to do was mix two things together, a form of realism or mimeticism intending to more accurately represent the world in the fiction, the way people think, the way people act, particularly he was concerned with, but also mix that with these fantastic, marvelous elements which are often missing, he was saying, from current modern prose, which he was saying was actually just quite dull. So in the Gothic in this period, one of the chief motifs is this attempt to blend these two aspects, the adventure, the marvelous, with the mimetic, with the realistic. Okay, so after Otranto, where did we go? What are the next stages? Well, quite a few little different options before the Gothic really took off in the 1790s. One of the texts which we can look at as having an inheritance from the Castle of Otranto and from Horace Walpole's work is The Recess by Sophia Lee. So this is, as it says on the cover there, a historical romance. So it's a reimagining of the past, and it features the two illegitimate daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots, so made-up characters. There was a little bit of backlash at the time about this alternative made-up history. But what we find here is certainly working on continuing the trend which Horace Walpole is instrumental in popularising, if not starting, although arguably starting as well, is this interest in writing these historical fictions, historical romances. There's others that are earlier than Walpole, like, for example, Longsword, Earl of Salisbury. But we also see this investigation of Gothic motifs. There's no supernatural in The Recess, really, but what we do find is the two daughters are brought up in a recess in an underground series of chambers and caverns below the house in secret. It's a space as well which was a sort of retreat for the monks after the Reformation. So you have this narrative of enclosure and then of pursuit and of tribulation and of trauma. It's an excellent read, recommend. Another next step after Walpole was The Old English Baron by Clara Reeve, originally published as The Champion of Virtue in 1777, and then republished in 1778 as The Old English Baron, which is very similar in some aspects to The Castle of Otranto. It features a peasant hero who is actually a nobleman. It's a story of usurpation and divine vengeance. It's a story of providence as well. Unlike Horace Walpole, though, Clara Reeve was creating a narrative of providence and how providence works. In her introduction, she notes her debt to Horace Walpole, suggesting that his project of uniting the modern and the ancient, the romance and the novel, was a noble project, but she critiqued him for his use of an excessive and superfluous supernatural. So she's saying, what she said was she's bringing it back within the bounds of probability. So she just has a couple of ghosts, a magically opening door, some prophetic dreams. But what we're finding here is this sort of narrowing down of the supernatural, this calming down of the supernatural, and almost paving the way for the supernatural explained, which we're going to see as a common technique later. The last book on this page is Anne Radcliffe's first novel. It reads somewhat like Juvenilia, The Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne. And it is different from some of her later work in that it maintains this medieval setting. It's the story of two castles, two houses. It is also a tale of usurpation. It's also a tale of a peasant who's really a noble in disguise. It's also a tale of multiple kidnappings of the same character. But it's quite clearly borrowing from that Walpolean start, which then becomes, in Radcliffe and other writers of the period, the Terror Gothic, which is more often set in the sort of early modern period. So the Terror Gothic. I prefer this term to the term female Gothic, which a lot of people will have heard of or will be familiar with. There's an excellent essay which I can put up on Twitter about this, which discusses the way in which the female Gothic is a term that was later retrospectively applied to what was going on. It also sometimes, to some extent, distorts our conception, because there's many of the texts that fit within this sort of basic description or type of Gothic, which were written by men, for example, and books by women, which do not fit within this Terror Gothic framework. So for me, I want to move away from the term female Gothic, and the Terror Gothic and Horror Gothic as denominations work more effectively for me. So where am I getting those differentiations from? Well, I'm getting that difference between terror and horror, obviously, from Anne Radcliffe's essay on the supernatural in poetry, where she distinguishes between terror, which uses uncertainty and curiosity to draw our minds forward into inquiry. So the noise that you hear, the possibility of the supernatural. And that is what's used to create fear and the affect of the text, the emotional impact of the text. Horror, on the other hand, according to Radcliffe, is where we're confronted with the horrible. We're confronted with the the monstrous, the grotesque. We're confronted with the dead body. We're confronted with the disturbingly fleshy ghost. We're confronted with the demonic. And in response to that, all that happens is we freeze up. That's horror. So I'm differentiating here between the terror and horror Gothic, using those as sort of the base understanding of what I'm meaning. Now, the terror Gothic, The Mysteries of Udolpho, is a paradigmatic example of this. Has a number of features which are commonly recurring. So we've got ruined castles or abbeys, these sort of scarred remains on the landscape of previous tyrannical systems which continue to dominate the present. Obviously, this appreciation of sublime landscapes, you'll often find the heroine or sometimes hero just sat on a mountaintop singing about trees. Just, you know, why not? You're only fleeing for your life, plenty of time to compose some poetry. Travel is a key part of these narratives. Now, Ellen Moyers mentions this in Literary Women. She calls Radcliffe's heroines traveling heroines because, yes, sure, they're fleeing for their lives, but they're also these heroines who are actively moving through the world in ways which weren't open to that many women of the period. There's an interest, of course, in tunnels, often tunnels through which escape is had. You can read them symbolically or not as you choose. Frequently religious institutions, both as places of fear and danger and entrapment, and as potentially places of safety, particularly for the persecuted female heroine. Now, we obviously have the virtuous heroine, and I'm using this piece of the infographic from The Guardian, which many of you will be familiar with. Gives you an idea of the type of heroine that we're often talking about. She can be a little bit plucky and curious, but she's very sensitive, very emotional, and does spend a lot of time fainting. So Emily is our winner with 10 faints. Yes, Emily, well done. Usually at inconvenient moments. As you can see as well from the white box, it's quite common for the men of the Gothic as well to often be fainting. Frankenstein manages it 3 times. Vathek, a book I'll talk about in a second, 3 times. And one of the characters in Charles Robert Maturin's Melmoth 4 times. Which brings us on to one of the characteristics of the genre, the Weeble hero. So what often we're sort of confined by our current understandings of what the hero is or might be, and our understanding of how a hero functions within the text, often to rescue. And, you know, particularly in modern feminist rewritings of stories, there's this irritation with the rescuing hero. Not to worry, he's completely useless in the Gothic. We don't have that sort of masculinist narrative of rescue usually, because the hero often fails. And signally fails to rescue the heroine, as we'll see in the example of the case study that I'm going to give in a couple of minutes. We're starting to see here, we have these villains that are attractive or charismatic, still very much villains, but the groundwork is being laid for those Byronic heroes and anti-heroes that we're going to see later on. We have the superstitious servants, often, as I've said before, providing a foil. That's sometimes reversed in the Italian by Anne Radcliffe. It's one of my favourites. Vivaldi the Master is the superstitious fool, and his servant Paolo is the one who's like, it's not ghost, though, is it? Then these texts in the Terror Gothic usually have a happy ending. So it's not like the Castle of Otranto where everybody's kind of dead at the end or just unhappy for life. But these usually have a closed ending, usually a sort of bourgeois ending, usually involves a romantic relationship, and often some sort of female economic autonomy, which is voluntarily sort of rendered up to the romantic hero figure. So let's have a look at a couple of case studies. What does the Terror Gothic look like in reality? Well, some of the most famous examples are, of course, the works of Anne Radcliffe, which were being published in the 1790s. So The Romance of the Forest, 1792, Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, and The Italian, 1796, 3 of her most famous works. In all of them, we have a heroine in peril is the main focus of the story, although in the Italian, there is a split focus between the hero and heroine. They undergo various vicissitudes, they undergo various perils, running away from those who would seek to take away their autonomy, steal their inheritance, and often pose a more physical and sexual threat as well. In doing so, they usually have some sort of encounter with the potentially supernatural. Now, let me give you a lowdown of the Romance of the Forest as a good example of the plot. It's one of my favorites, so that's why I'm going to go over it with you very briefly. But our heroine is Adeline, and the poor thing, totally lost from the beginning. What is going on? The person that she thinks is her father isn't her father. He's actually a sort of hired murderer from her uncle. She has been raised partly in a convent, and her father comes to take her from it. She comes to ask her to take the vows. She refuses, so he comes to take her from it. He ends up taking her to a den of robbers, and then because he doesn't really want to kill her, he just sort of gives her to this family, the Lamotts, and she ends up sort of tagging along with them. They're fleeing Paris for debt. They end up staying in a ruined abbey. And the ruined abbey is the key to everything, because that's where Adeline discovers the secret of her father's identity and his death, thanks to some helpful ghosts and dreams. It's also where we meet the villainous Marquis de Montault, who's her uncle, but nobody knows that at the beginning. So first of all, he's trying to seduce her, then he's trying to kidnap her. And she also meets Theodore, the useless hero. He manages to rescue her, very exciting, for less than a day, because he gets into a duel, a needless duel, gets injured, gets court-martialed, and spends the rest of the novel in prison, while Adeline either saves herself or is saved by a variety of different servants. So that's a brief potted history. I'm going to give you another couple of examples, and I'm using these because I think they're really good examples of the Terror Gothic, but also the way in which this isn't a formulaic genre. This isn't just a single formula which gets repeated across texts. And also they're good examples of the way in which we must refrain from universalizing some of these aspects of the text. So The Orphan of the Rhine by Eleanor Sleaf was published in 1798. It's particularly interesting because it offers such a plethora of stories. It's like a Russian doll, a matryoshka, where we just keep finding more stories of Julie, the first seeming protagonist, Lorette, and then Rico, who one of them is her child, one of them is her adopted child, but of course they're in love with each other. Classic Gothic. Laroque, who is constantly in peril. Adela, who seems fine, but she's also got a tragic history. Father Benedict, Father Andrea, the goat herd's daughter, Sister Cecilia, Signora Dorfo, the Marchese himself. So we're constantly being bombarded with these stories of tragedy and persecution. We've got mysterious monks popping up. We have betrayal. We have seduction, kidnap, mistaken murder in a classic Gothic move. Oh no, I have stabbed my wife. I was meaning to stab my mistress. Murder most foul of the deliberate variety. Fake marriages, or is it? It isn't. It isn't. It was real all along. Mystery orphans, forest assassins, much, much more. So you see the sort of the wide variety of stories, but what's particularly interesting about Orphan of the Rhine is the way in which the narrative is very overtly Catholic or pro-Catholic. Now, Eleanor Sleaf wasn't a Catholic writer, particularly as far as we know, but most of these characters are very overtly Catholic. The monastic institutions are very positively coded. Julie refuses to marry anybody who isn't a Catholic, for example. Doesn't go that well for her, but when that particular stance is not critiqued by the text necessarily. So often we think, I've talked about this before in other lectures, so do go back and have a look at my Monstrous Faith one. But we often think about the Gothic as anti-Catholic, but it papers over what's actually going on. And this is a good example of the way in which not all Gothic texts are anti-Catholic at all. The next example is Ethel Weiner by T.J. Horsley Curtis, partly a useful demonstration of the way in which men can write terror Gothics. It's set in an earlier period again, so not the early modern period that we're seeing in those last two texts, but the 14th century in Wales. And it's a story about Ethel Weiner, who very usually for a Gothic text, but unusually for actual history, has an inheritance of her own from, I think it's a paternal grandfather. And also when her younger brother Arthur goes missing, she becomes the heir and then the ruler of the whole sort of Demesne land area. They're also raised alongside two orphans, Augustine and Emma. And of course, very tidily, Ethelwina and Augustine are an item, Arthur and Emma are an item, even though Arthur's kidnapped as a child, but Emma still like holds out, even though he's probably dead. Let me just show you very briefly. This is a bit of an aside, but I enjoy it. Augustine, he finds out why they're orphaned, and it's to do with the disgrace of his father. And he declares his love, but at the same time says, I'm not worthy of you. So he has to go and fight overseas to prove his valor, and obviously therefore leaves her defenseless. Nailed it. Anyway, long have I struggled against the transports of my heart. Vainly have I tried to subdue its ardent sensation. I hope from the background picture you're seeing where I'm going with this. This is a text that predates Pride and Prejudice, but I think there's some really interesting overlap between Darcy's proposal, obviously, and this Gothic proposal. But it's like the anti-Darcy. So where Darcy is like, I fought against it because you're not worthy of me. This is the opposite. I fought against it because I'm not worthy of you. Anyway, the baddie in this is Leopold Lord de Saint-Hiver, who is the cousin. He attempts to marry Ethelwina while she's unconscious, but as she points out, that doesn't count. So he kidnaps her instead to his castle in Wales. It's an excellent story. I do recommend reading it. I can send people copies if you need one. So I won't give away all the spoilers of what happens, but it's one of the more terrifying of these early Gothics, partly through this device of a teetering tower in which she is imprisoned above a gulf. You also have something quite interesting going on here in terms of the way that servants are depicted. So you have the evil servants, Agatha and Ruthma, of Leopold, versus the sort of good, noble servants who come to the rescue, even though Bertram and Rupert. So Bertram is actually originally a servant to Leopold, but is a turncoat and ends up helping our heroine. But you have quite an interesting, I think, here, depiction of the servants with somewhat more humanity, and there's a little bit more class consciousness to the piece, partly arguably because of T.J. Horsley Curtis's slightly lower social status. It's also worth pointing out that there's a very real ghost in this text. It's the murdered father of Arthur and Ethelwina, who ends up sort of dramatically appearing and protecting them, and we find out about his murder because of a conveniently abandoned dagger and bloody sheet combo. Why does nobody tidy up after themselves after murdering in the Gothic? So that's the Terror Gothic. Let's have a look at the Horror Gothic and where the Gothic goes from here. So the Horror Gothic is much more involved with the actually horrible, the actually supernatural. The Monk is obviously one of the most famous examples of this, written in 1796 by Matthew Lewis. It depicts the story of Ambrosio, a monstrous monk who gives in to his lusts. Some of the features of this are particular to this text, but there are also, many of them are frequent features of this Horror Gothic. So we have corrupt monks, not just people trying to block your escape, but monks who are depraved, preying on the weak, engaging in torture, rapine, rape. We also have demonic contracts. We have the sex-changing demon, arguably, or the very gender-ambiguous demon, who is both Rosario and Matilda, and is eventually revealed to be a demon, so their gender is unclear. We have undead nuns, bloody and dripping and terrifying. We have immortal wanderers in the style of Faust, arguably, in terms of the Wandering Jew. We have matricide and rape, incestuous rape. We have rotting babies because somebody is imprisoned while pregnant. And we also, of course, have real devils in the text. So let me give you my top 5 tropes that we often find in the Horror Gothic. We have got inquisitional torture. The Inquisition appears in both the Terror and the Horror Gothic, but in the Horror Gothic, you're going to find a lot more detail, often quite lascivious detail as well. A lot of maidens' white arms being bound up with rope and things. There's monastic depravity, as I've already mentioned. Necromancy and ghosts. I've kind of clubbed those together because they often appear together, but you have these tales of necromancers and of very real ghosts. Secret societies and robber bands, again, they seem a bit strange to put together, but secret societies were particularly of interest in the German Gothic, and we do get an inheritance of that to some extent in the British Gothic. But we have this idea of these societies, whether they're secret societies or robber bands, which are a source of threat, monstrous, indefinable threat sometimes to our hero and or heroine. And we also have, of course, the demonic pact. So let me give you an example of some horror Gothic texts. Obviously, we have The Monk with my favourite cover there. The Horrid Mysteries by Karl Gross. This is a story that is a translation from the German and features secret societies at war with each other, in fact. Charlotte Dacre's A Floy of the Moor is a sort of female version of the Ambrosio story. It's the fall of Victoria, once again, into lust and murder. Zastrozzi, an early work by Percy Bysshe, Shelley there, is a tale of certainly a lot of imprisonment, a lot of being bound up, murder, betrayal, all the usual. And then one of the texts which is considered sort of the end, really, of this Gothic period, one of the last great works from the early Gothic period, is Charles Robert Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, which in which we see a wanderer, not immortal, but he's had 150 extra years, goes around the world tempting people in despair to swap places with him, to sell their soul in order to gain those extra years of life. Now, just a couple of things about what was going on in terms of international influence, what was working with the publishing, how people were consuming the Gothic. There is a really strong German influence on the horror Gothic particularly. So the Sturm und Drang movement in Germany predates really this sort of 1790s efflorescence of the Gothic in Britain. We're talking sort of the 60s, 70s. And examples include The Robbers by Schiller. You've got Lenore there by Berger. There's lots of other examples, but it's a literature of sensation, emotion, an anti-rationalist movement, which often features crime, daring deeds, and the supernatural. And so you do find that these texts are an influence on writers such as Matthew Lewis, Shelley, and Byron, who were reading these German stories. We also find a lot of German texts appearing in Britain in translation. So I've already mentioned The Horrid Mysteries, and in previous weeks I've talked about The Necromancer or Tale of the Black Forest by Carl Friedrich Kallert, which is a translation from Peter Tutold. Very loose translation. So we're getting these translations and adaptations, in a sense, of German texts. Now, how are people consuming Gothic? Now, there are a number of publishers who published Gothic, but of course, one of the most famous of these was the Minerva Press, which produced regularly large numbers of Gothic texts. They functioned from approximately 1790 to 1820 and were set up by William Lane in connection with his own circulating library. So a circulating library is where you pay a fee basically to borrow books. And he published a wide variety of texts, which then supplied these circulating libraries, which were making these books far more available to a much wider audience because of lowering the cost of access to them. So we're really seeing a boom in this period of readership and a change really in the reading public and who has access to texts. So he takes from a stable of regular authors as well as less regular authors, but some of his regulars were Regina Marie Roche, Eliza Parsons, Eleanor Sleeth, and Elizabeth Meek. A lot of the books were also published anonymously, and a lot of them were sort of less well regarded, often seen as being sort of the equivalent, I would say, of mass market publishing today, where sometimes they're seen as formulaic. But there's also great works within them. So Regina Marie Roche, her Children of the Abbey, for example, was one of the most popular Gothic texts of the period and sold in multiple editions well into the 19th century. Another way in which people were consuming the Gothic was chapbooks. Now, chapbooks were smaller and much cheaper and available to a lower class as well, much more accessible. Now, quite frequently, these would feature sections taken from larger Gothic works. So this example here of Almagro and Claude, or Claude, is actually a section taken from The Monk by Matthew Lewis. It's The Tale of the Robbers. They might also be a sort of summary or quick version of a larger Gothic text. So The Veiled Picture, or The Mysteries of Gorgono, which has been reprinted by Valancourt Books, so it's quite readily available, is basically The Mysteries of Udolpho in short form. So a lot of these texts were sort of easy access points to those other Gothic works. There were also original texts being produced as well. They tended to be somewhat more sensational. Talking of sensation, there was also in the period flourishing of Gothic drama, particularly sort of in that 1790s and early 19th century period. Now, some of these were Gothic adaptations. A lot of these were Gothic adaptations of Gothic novels. So one of the most famous is James Bowden's Fountainville Forest from 1794, which is an adaptation of The Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe. Now, there is something, one of the difficulties, let us say, of translating particularly those terror Gothics, which rely on uncertainty and ambiguity, to the stage, was the fact that because this is a visual medium, decisions had to be made. Is there a ghost or isn't there? Do we show what there is or not? How do we possibly maintain an ambiguity? And so James Bowden, at least, was like, yeah, just stuck a ghost in there, made it very obvious. And a lot of these plays were often more sensational, with more overt examples of the supernatural, which were one of the many drawing points to the theatre. There were also a range of original works, some of which were never performed. The Mysterious Mother by Horace Walpole, for example, was incredibly scandalous because it included, it's basically a story of incest between a mother and her son, on his part unknowingly, and on her part partially knowingly. And it's also incidental incest between her two children then as well. Venoni, I've talked about before. This was by Matthew Lewis. So you are getting quite a lot of overlap between Gothic dramatists and Gothic novelists. He wrote of Venoni, which is a tale of Catholic persecution. And Charles Maturin, before publishing Melmoth the Wanderer, also published Gothic dramas such as Bertram, which is a really interesting text, partly because we do have extant a lot of his letters of the period about the process of producing this play and the decisions that had to be made regarding the representation of the supernatural. So if you look for his letters to Horace Walpole, there's an edition. Very good, very interesting. So before I finish this section, I'm going to just chat about some of the paths left travelled. So we've been looking at some of the key sort of streams and paths taken by the Gothic, but there were also paths which maybe got picked up again later, but didn't start a major movement at the time. So one of these we've talked about before, William Beckford's Vathek from 1782, was an Orientalist Gothic with a nominally Islamic protagonist who ends up engaged in devil worship, to the consternation of all the actual Muslims in the text. It's a tale again of fall, temptation, and the demonic. But this sort of Orientalist Gothic will become much more popular in the 19th century, but didn't quite take off in this period. We've also got Mary Wollstonecraft's Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman. It's an unfinished novel that was interrupted, of course, by her death. It's incredibly bleak, and it's certainly a feminist Gothic. And what Mary Wollstonecraft does is she peels back the encoding that's often happening in these terror Gothic novels or female-written Gothic novels. What's being encoded is often the threat of men specifically and of patriarchal structures. But she strips back the curtain and just lays it out. Abodes of horror have frequently been described in castles filled with spectres and chimeras, conjured up by the magic spell of genius to harrow the soul and absorb the wandering mind. But formed of such stuff as dreams are made of, what were they to the mansion of despair, in one corner of which Maria sat, endeavouring to recall her scattered thoughts? So there's this sense that all of these distancing techniques, this medieval world, has nothing to compare to the reality of women's place in law, for example, of the current day, because Mariah's been cast off by her husband and he has the power to both take her child and put her in the asylum. None of the endings to this were particularly happy. She never finished it, but she had drafted a couple of different endings. It's very depressing. Also in the path less travelled, you have the philosophical Gothic of a writer like William Godwin. I've picked 3 examples there, 3 themes that he delved into. Perhaps most famous is Caleb Williams from 1794, which is the story of a servant who discovers his master's secret locked in a box. And then his master basically hounds him and persecutes him unto the ends of the country. There's obviously a sort of reflection here, arguably, on a Calvinist conception of this wrathful God, but more overtly, it's also reflecting on the justice system within England, and it's a damning critique thereof. St. Leon by William Godwin is the story of a man who takes the elixir vitae and becomes immortal. You can definitely read it alongside William Godwin's political justice, and particularly his writings on a concept of human immortality as part of our development as a society towards sort of a better state and way of being. And so you can read this as an extended meditation on this attempt to claim immortality for the individual rather than as a community effort. And Mandeville by William Godwin is amazing and is about sort of religious sectarianism and the effect of it. What's really interesting about all of his novels are they can be very hard to read because they're all first person, and all of their first person narrators are fairly objectionable people. But it's incredibly interesting. And Mandeville is one of the first novels, I think, where you're basically reading the villain's account. He just doesn't realize he's the villain. Recommend. The Gothic of theological perversion. So you'll see in these 2 examples that I've picked examples from different traditions. So we've got American in the Wieland or the Transformation, and the Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg, a Scottish author. But what we're finding, there is a subset of the Gothic, I would argue, that is very clearly engaged, often with Calvinist principles and with concepts of religious extremism. So Wieland is obviously a story about a biloquist or a ventriloquist. It's a story about a descent into madness and the erasure of difference between the real and the unreal. It's a tale of murder. But it's also a discussion of the effect of these particular rigorously borderline Calvinistic religious systems, or more esoteric almost as well, religious systems. The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner is the story of a man who believes himself to be elect, chosen by God to be saved, and he engages in a form of antinomianism. That is, he believes that nothing that he does has any impact on his salvation because he is elect. And we see this as a form of damnation, where the devil, in the form of Gil Martin, leads him down a path to eventual self-destruction. By the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, you're finding Gothic parody occurring. A lot of these tropes had become familiar, had become repeated, and there were a certain amount of formulaic texts, such as the Libertines, that we've read in one of our groups, in one of my YouTube videos. But there are different forms of parody that appear. The most famous of the parodies, of course, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. So published 1817, but written about 1803, I think. And it's a sort of a gentle parody here, where Catherine Morland is an aficionado of Gothic texts, and she understands the world. She reads the world through that Gothic lens, always misinterpreting what's going on. Except, does she? Because what her lens offers her is what this sort of Gothic lens offers is a way to see the world and uncover the Gothic world behind sort of the veneer of society. So she presumes that the father of her beloved is a murderer, and he's not, but he is a spousal abuser, and he is a sort of avatar of a ruthless patriarchal and aristocratic society. And her Gothic lens allows her to see that. So we're getting a peeling back in Northanger Abbey, a are moving away from the excesses of Gothic fiction, but pointing to the way in which these texts do encode a Gothic reality of the world. A crueler parody, let us say, a more mocking one, is Thomas Love Peacock's Nightmare Abbey, where he takes in Gothic tropes, he takes in romanticists, particularly romantic figures who are all thinly veiled and represented in Nightmare Abbey. He takes in various forms of transcendental philosophy and mocks it, gives everybody a terrible ending. It's quite funny, but you have to probably be in the zone of the philosophy and the movements to enjoy it. So, last thing before we have our break, don't worry, we're almost there. Is where does the Gothic go from here? I've talked about the way this early Gothic period is coming to an end, but it's not just an end, it's also a beginning. We're seeing the seeds of what will become the Gothic in the 19th century. So a couple of things that we're seeing coming to the fore. The vampire. Now, I've got a whole class on the vampire, of course, so please do go and watch that if you want more details about this. But after the poetry that proliferates in the late 18th, very early 19th century, you obviously get the first short story in English, there's an early one in German, of the vampire and this sort of sense of the aristocratic, Byronic vampire. And it wasn't written by Lord Byron, as the byline says there. Although it was sold as if it were by Lord Byron for a little while. It was written by his physician, John William Polidori, and features the Byronic anti-hero as a villain, as a monstrous other. You also have, of course, in Frankenstein, the start of this Gothic science fiction. Now, Mary Shelley was not the first writer of science fiction. There are other examples, other places that we can trace that back to, such as Margaret Cavendish and The Burning World. But it's certainly, we're seeing the start, arguably, or seeing a growing interest in this sort of modern beginnings of sci-fi or science fiction. And this interest and engagement with this fear and fascination with the technology and scientific advances of the time, such as galvanism. Now, before I finish, I don't want to do Mary Shelley dirty and suggest that the Frankenstein is all she has to offer us, because very clearly not. She wrote a number of short stories, poems, and novels, and here are just a couple. Matilda is a novella which features an incestuous love of a father for his daughter. Don't worry, nothing gets acted on. People leap off cliffs instead, and then go and sort of live in a hut in the wild, the other person. The Last Man, very topical, features a world decimated by plague, in which only one man survives. It's a futuristic novel set, I think, in the 23rd century. I'm not sure, but they travel by air balloon and it's adorable. And then Valperga, which is a story with two female protagonists. It's a story of religious success. It's a story of murder, death, lust, love. It's great. So do go check out more Mary Shelley. Don't just stop at Frankenstein. Question time. Walk into the night and leave your uncertainty behind. There we go. So, does anybody have any questions? Last Man is definitely a bit too close to home at the moment. It's also very difficult to read, isn't it? Like, I have to admit, I do not enjoy the writing style in The Last Man, but there we go. My love. Yields. Currently reading Nightmare Abbey. Oh, I hope you're enjoying it. I'm just going through to see if there are any comments that I need to reply to. Did anybody get the 15 out of 15? Did anybody get Mistress of Melon? Oh, no, I'm sad. Never mind. Does anyone have any questions about that first bit? Packed full of informations. Oh, thank you. Starts in 2077 and ends in 2100, The Last Man. I was thinking it was a bit nearer to now than I was saying. But yeah, I love the idea that we might be traveling in hot air balloons. I wish. That would have been so much cooler. I also love the way in which sentimentality and sensibility are still the dominant modes of discourse in her world, which is so obviously very distant to what we have now. Gotham has kept its blimps. There you go. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. You mentioned inspiration is taken from the medieval and the Gothic, and mentioned demonic pacts a lot. What would you consider Marlowe's Faustus? Proto-Gothic, maybe? I'm a bit rusty on my 1500s. I mean, there's a lot of scholars that are working on the Proto-Gothic at the moment, so I don't really want to speak on their research because it's not something I research specifically. I would say that certainly you're seeing borrowings and inspiration from earlier periods. Somebody asked about Jacobin revenge tragedies this morning as well. And I think you're certainly seeing, there's obviously, as with all genres, there's no divide where we suddenly get rid of this literary past. And you do certainly see an interaction and borrowing with it. So to what extent you can call it proto-Gothic, and to what extent you would just want to trace the way in which the Gothic borrows from it, I think is up for debate. But there's certainly a connection. In the demonic lecture, I talked quite a bit about the Faust myth, the Faust story, and how they connect together. Because obviously Marlowe is just one iteration of Faust. And we do see various iterations, folkloric and otherwise. I'm curious about the term ghoul you've used in the title. Being a type of jinn, was it used during the Gothic period, or is this name used more now? I would say it's definitely used more now. You've got some references to ghouls and afrits, for example, in Byron's The Giaour. So you do have references to it in these few examples of the more sort of Orientalist, Gothic slash the romantic Orientalist romanticism. Where you are getting these references to ghouls and an understanding of them as a specific thing from Islamic theology or Islamic belief systems. But yeah, I would think certainly they're more sort of common as an idea or an understanding now of that difference. I think that, yeah, not too off topic. I hope I answered that very briefly. Certainly the idea of the jinn, I'm not really seeing it arising in the Gothic. Obviously it's there from the popularity of the Arabian Nights and that translation in the 18th century, but it's not being adopted by the Gothic so much at that period. How much of the Gothic and its popularity was a pushback against modern religion in the 18th and 19th centuries? You see, I feel that the Gothic isn't necessarily a pushback against. I think it's often a manifestation of these. I think it's. I don't want to be overly simplistic and say that it's a rejection of sort of Enlightenment rationalism, but I think that the Gothic is often used as a space of theological inquiry, which leaves open those issues such as the supernatural, for example, and that you will often find that Gothic writers are particularly allied to specific belief systems and specific forms, often of dissenting Protestantism. So you've got Anna Letitia Barbauld, obviously, was a Unitarian / Presbyterian. Anne Radcliffe was known to have involvement with dissenting circles as she grew up. Somebody like James Hogg was obviously in the Kirk of Scotland Presbyterian. So I think that you're probably going to get both. Outside the strict rules of the religions of the day, I think there's an interesting argument to be made that the Gothic explores the space outside often of a conservative Anglicanism. So you're getting often, but not always, a move into investigations of questions which are still fraught within the Anglican Church, such as the supernatural. But then you have writers like Clara Reeve, for example, was a very staunch Protestant Anglican. T.J. Horsley Curtis, very strong, very staunch Anglican. So you are getting as well just a more broad reflection of Anglicanism. A lot of these providential narratives are very sort of via media Anglicanism of the late 18th century, definitely. In terms of the strict rules, like I think you certainly see a rejection of legalism in some of the writings of people like in those texts that critique theological perversity. So the Scottish Gothic and a lot of the, obviously a lot of the American Gothic with Hawthorne, Brogden Brown as well. You're seeing that sort of thing coming up, I think. Any more questions? No? Okay, let's get into the Victorian period. I'm going to try and get through this. This has taken me longer today than it took me this morning, which is normally the opposite case. Oh well, okay. Victorians, don't crucify me, Victorianists. I can see you glaring at me. So what I'm going to be doing here is just investigating a few of the ways in which the Gothic sort of is reborn and manifests in the 19th century. The first thing that I would always be mentioning is the Brontës, because what the Brontës did was obviously create Gothic texts, which to some extent romanced the Gothic and reimagined the Gothic. So we see a movement away from some of the paradigms you're finding in the 18th century. The heroines of the Gothic from the early 18th century were fleeing and surviving encounters with darkness, whereas in these Brontë texts, we're finding a darkness tamed or claimed for oneself. So in Jane Eyre, arguably, there's a narrative of taming the darkness, taming the beast, although there is also a certain appeal to that darkness, that freedom, that life outside the strict lines of convention. In Wuthering Heights, as I've already talked about, you see a much more kind of destructive relationship. And the darkness isn't, in a sense, Cathy's claiming of Heathcliff, but rather claiming an acknowledgement of her own transgressive nature that we find in these texts. That what we're not getting is a confrontation with the darkness where the virtuous heroine flees, but we're getting this kind of mixing together. The heroes in the Brontës, very influentially in terms particularly of the Gothic romance in the 20th century and how Gothic heroism has developed. We see the move from the Gothic villain, that's Montoni from the Mysteries of Udolpho on the left there, to the Byronic anti-hero. And I talked about this at much more length in When Love and Death Embrace. So if you want to know more about my ideas here, then go back and have a quick look at that. But you have the Byronic anti-hero, who by their very nature is doomed, and their love is doomed, and the people they love are doomed because working outside the boundaries and the laws, but they don't feature as villains so much as anti-heroes. And then you have the progression to the dark hero figure, the Rochester, the one who needs to be redeemed, the one who needs to be tamed. Now, this morning I also mentioned that part of this, Marina Warner points out, she studies fairy tales, obviously, but in discussing the Beauty and the Beast myth, I think it's quite useful because she talks about the way in which we developed from a narrative of saving the beast and redeeming to being attracted to the beast despite the appearance, to being attracted to the beast because. And we certainly see that with these Gothic dark heroes, that there's an attraction despite and an attraction because, and depending on the novel, which one of those wins out will change because of that darkness and what they represent outside of the boundaries of convention. What we also find in the work of the Brontës, I think, is an interesting reconfiguration of these othered landscapes. So within the Victorian Gothic, there's a move from the outside to the in. So in a lot of 18th century Gothic, we have these more exotic settings, often in Europe, sometimes in these outlying districts of the UK, but written from not within those places, written from outside of them, written within the security of civilization. But what you find in the Victorian Gothic is often a narrative of a horror come home that's invaded England, it's invaded our cities, it's invaded our houses. And you can arguably say that that's what we're finding in the Brontës, a horror come home. You can also suggest that what we're finding still is simply this narrative of the othered North. The North particularly is viewed as a place of religious dissidence. So the north of England, particularly Yorkshire and Lancashire, you had remnants of Catholicism for a lot longer. You had a lot of religious dissent. You also have a lot of working class movements. You have this association with violent working class rebellions, such as the Luddites. And you also have this sense of a northern otherness. But you've got to remember that the Brontes were writing as well from within the North, and I think there's an interesting expansion of this Gothic othered space, and this idea of not just the desolation, barbarism, and unknownness of it, but of its freedom, of its appeal, and of its appeal. And I think it's that conception, in a sense, of these landscapes which has dominated and continued to inform our understanding of the Bronte moors, at least. So I've said that horror comes home within the Victorian Gothic to a large extent, and we see this in a variety of ways. So we do see this move quite often of the Gothic into cities, from sort of the dark, crowded streets of Oliver Twist to those of the curious case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Where we're seeing this sort of dark, monstrous urban environment, a London, a corrupt and perverse London in a sense. Obviously, this is in part a reflection of the increased urbanization and the sort of interaction with these kind of monstrous industrial towns, these cluttered, crime-ridden streets, etc. So it's a reflection of those kind of changing realities and fears, but also this sense of, within the Victorian Gothic, this evil is not something outside, from which we're safe when we get home. It's part of us. And you find that also in terms of this move into the house. So a very obvious example of this, of course, is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, where you have a governess, evil, ghostly presences perhaps, and very creepy children. One of the major movements in the Victorian Gothic, or Gothic aligned, how the Gothic progressed in the Victorian period, is of course the ghost story. So there's this connection to Christmas about which we're all aware. It's an old tradition in England. You see this example from Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, the quote, "A sad tale's best for winter. I have one of sprites and goblins." So there is very much a pre-existing tradition, which again became popularized, particularly in the Victorian period, in part, and it's often associated with the work of Dickens, although not entirely. Things like the publication of Household Words, which is the weekly journal, but also always had a Christmas issue with different Christmas ghost stories from famous ghost story writers. And there's also, of course, his Christmas editions, of which there were 5, which were sort of specially bound and illustrated editions of these Christmas ghost stories. The most famous is A Christmas Carol, but you've also got The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, A Love Story, and The Haunted Man and The Ghost Bargain, which is probably my favourite. It's the story of a man who is haunted by his own memories and makes a pact to be rid of them. So you're getting that sort of Christmas ghost story narrative, but that's not the end of the ghost story in the Victorian period, of course. You're getting this real development and investment in the short story. This isn't limited to England, and one of the most influential figures, of course, was Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I'm not going to talk particularly to the specific American context here, because we're going to have a lecturer come in and talk to us about American Gothic, and they're going to cover it more thoroughly and better. But we can look at some of the aspects of these tales, what they're starting to include. So the first picture there is from The Pit and the Pendulum, which of course is a story of a man slowly seeing his death approach. It's an example of the way in which Edgar Allan Poe developed this psychological horror as part of his tales. We have The House of Usher, again, narratives of decadence, let us say, and decay. And then again, another very topical tale, The Mask of the Red Death. A bunch of rich people hide in a house, but they can't escape the plague. But this kind of psychological terror, often frequently body horror, and this movement beyond the simple ghostly were sort of key to Edgar Allan Poe's contribution, in a sense, to the development of the ghost story and the short Gothic story in the Victorian period. Another large trend in the Victorian period was the Gothic fantastic. You're particularly seeing this, I would say, in other national traditions. And I have 3 national traditions represented here from slightly different periods. The tall picture is The Hauler by Guy de Maupassant, and it's a French tale. Then you have at the top Sylphida by Adayevsky, so The Sylph by Vladimir Adayevsky, and below that Hoffman's Sandman. Now, each of these tales is fantastic in that there's never a full resolution about what's real and what's not. And they often explore the boundaries of our understanding of reality and also the distance between madness and sanity, the real, the unreal, the supernatural and the natural. The Hauler features an invisible creature or essence which starts drinking his water, which he can sense but not see. And it's never quite clear whether he's there or not. But it's an essence or creature which drains the life out of people while they sleep. Sylphida is the story of a man who finds a water nymph in his glass of water, or does he? And Hoffman's Sandman, of course, is famous, in part familiar to a lot of Gothic scholars through Freud's writing on it in his essay on the uncanny, which I do not like the read at all. But it's a story of a young man who met in his youth somebody that he partly believed to be the Sandman, and a man who had threatened to burn his eyes out. He meets him again in later life, and it sort of starts to trigger a descent into madness. This is also made worse by the fact that the object of his affections is actually an inhuman automaton. So lots of different forms of Gothic short stories are appearing. Ghost stories proper and perhaps weird fiction, Gothic fantastic fiction. And we have just a raft of different authors publishing in journals, magazines, collections as well. These are a couple of names, but they're only barely scratching the surface of some of these mid to late Victorian writers, or mid to late 19th century writers. Gaskell, Margaret Oliphant is a Scottish writer, very good on depiction of the afterlife. We've got Edgar Bulwer-Lytton, Vernon Lee, who we talked about last Sunday, of course, Elizabeth Bowen and Margaret Bowen, M.R. James, Sheridan Le Fanu, Edith Nesbit, Edith Wharton. And you're finding a number of different themes which keep appearing within a number of these texts. So spiritualism and the impact of spiritualism. So attempts to communicate with the dead become an increasing feature of the Victorian ghost story. Investigations into the reality of life after death and its form, particularly in the work of Margaret Oliphant. Theological inquiry about the nature of the soul, about the nature of death. Of course, you have the more metaphorical readings of a returning past, encoded meanings, as we found in Vernon Lee last week, in that example, queer readings. Invasions of the home, and again, that repetition of the idea of the home as not a place of safety. In tales such as The Signalman by Charles Dickens, we have this uneasy relationship with technology and the haunted technology. Narratives of inescapable fate, and ones which test the limits of our knowledge. So how were people consuming text? Well, we've already talked about the magazines. We're also in the 19th century seeing the rise of the penny dreadful, which you're looking at from about the 1830s. Now, these are not like the chapbooks. So the chapbooks were shorter versions or short extracts from stories, but the penny dreadfuls were published usually weekly. They would cost 1 penny, and they were serialized stories. So there's some examples here of some of the most famous ones. Varney the Vampire, keeping that vampire tradition alive in the 19th century. Wagner the Werewolf by George Reynolds, which is one of the first werewolf sort of long stories in English literary stories. The Mysteries of London, which of course is slightly connected there to the Mysteries of Paris by Eugene Sue. And The String of Pearls, which you more commonly known as Sweeney Todd. It's worth noting, by the way, that Varney the Vampire comes in at roughly 667,000 words. So imagine reading that. It's an absolute tome. So we've got this interest in a sort of sensational literature, much more widely available to different classes of people because of that low cost. Another manifestation of this interest in sensation and the darkness is found in the Newgate literature, which became popular in the 20s and 30s. The examples I've got on the left-hand side are two examples from William Harrison Ainsworth. We've got Rookwood, a romance, which features Dick Turpin, and 1839, The History of Jack Sheppard, which is a story of murder and robbery, etc. Now, to some extent, there was a decline in this form of literature, in part as a reaction to this particular criminal case where life imitates art. The 1840 murder of Lord William Russell by his valet, Francois Benjamin Courvoisier. And in some of his discussions with his lawyer, he suggested that he had been inspired by the Jack Sheppard story for certain elements of the crime, in which, having been caught out stealing by his employer, he decided to murder him in his bed, and in order to not to get any blood on his clothes, he murdered him completely naked. So this interest in Newgate fiction and criminal fiction and real-life criminals morphed arguably into the sensation fiction, which really rose to the fore in that mid-19th century period. The sensation fiction deals in heightened emotions, sensational events, secrets, and crimes. Two examples here. On the left-hand side, you have The Woman in White, which is a story of doubles, perfidy, asylums, an attempt to disinherit our heroine. On the right-hand side, you have Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, which is a tale of unintentional bigamy and very intentional murder. Again, we're sort of tracing the pathways here, and we're seeing, moving from these texts, we're seeing this move into detective fiction as well. Now, of course, what is often considered to be the first detective story, or the first modern detective story, is Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is in the 40s. I won't give you spoilers if you've not read it, but it's a story which mixes both horror and the detective tale, quite clearly Gothic, in a sense, this sort of monstrous narratives of bodies stuffed up chimneys. We also have the narrative detective fiction continuing and proliferating in that second part of the 19th century. I'm not saying that every detective story is Gothic, but we can certainly trace the Gothic roots of the detective story, and some texts deliberately engage particularly with that Gothicism. So a good example of this is The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle, where we have those Gothic moors, and it's arguably a detective, a Gothic detective of the supernatural explained, because it's not a hellhound in the end, is it? It's just a dog. It's just men in the end. So moving up to the end of the century, we've got the Decadent Gothic. And some of our most famous Gothic texts appear in this period. But before talking about sort of the more general themes and ideas which are appearing in Decadent Gothic, it's worth noting the proliferation of the Imperial Gothic at this period. So using sort of Edward Said's conception of Orientalism, which uses a concept of the Orient as barbaric, mysterious, irrational, dangerous, tantalizing, as a foil for Britain. So these texts involved characters entering colonized spaces, usually within the British Empire, and encountering danger and threat there from a barbarous, mysterious other reality. So She by H. Rider Haggard involves a visit to Africa and an encounter with a 2,000-year-old sorceress. The Beetle by Richard Marsh in the middle involves a man escaping from a cult of human sacrifice in Egypt and returning to London only to be dogged by an indescribable figure. Are they human? Are they not? Are they male? Are they female? Who knows? Nobody knows anything about them, not even their size. And the Moonstone is set predominantly or connected predominantly to India, and is again a discussion of sort of crime, high passions, a bit of magic going on really. So more broadly, the Decadent Gothic is invested in that sort of end of the 19th century period, and it reflects a couple of preoccupations with excess and artificiality, but also a number of the fears and inquiries of that era. So the fear of the collapse of empire and weakening British power, and also the threat from the outside, from these foreign others. There's also atavism, which is the sort of Gothic side of evolution, I always think. So evolution, with the theory of evolution came the fear of the ability to regress down the evolutionary scale. And we certainly see that in a work like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where Hyde is the troglodytic, arguably sort of atavistic version of Jekyll. We've got technologies and the borders of a new world being investigated, sometimes with fear, sometimes with hope. So in Dracula, of course, it's telegrams and rail networks that solve our problems. And there's also this interest in madness, psychology, psychopathy, and illness, which you're finding in the Gothic at this period. Now, some of the most famous examples deal with particular themes. So there's this sense of the dangerous double, an investigation of the atavistic self in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, although I obviously give it a theological reading as well, based on Calvinist theologies, and a picture of Dorian Gray with that amazing picture there. And this investigation, obviously, in Wilde of concepts of aesthetics and beauty, but also this unease with artificiality. You also, of course, have the resurgence of the vampire in Carmilla, which is a lesbian vampire story, of course, and in Bram Stoker's Dracula, both of which perform are sort of transgressive or reflect transgressive sexualities, and also reflect a fear, particularly in Dracula, of the foreign other. So, bit of a whiz through the Victorian period there. Question break. You cannot escape, so you might as well ask a question. So, anybody got a question or a thought? Nice. Yeah, I'm seeing some really interesting comments, and yes, agreeing with everything that you guys are saying. Definitely. I think the Gothic is always, so replying to Tree's comment there about this sort of metaphor for McCarthyism, I think the Gothic's always a really interesting mode to explore these sort of darkly distanced representations of monstrous political and social realities of the current day. Any more questions for now? That was very whizzing through. I've made up the time that I lost from the first section as I sprint towards the finish. Were these Gothic novels very popular during the Victorian period? Not a silly question. Yeah, they were. They weren't universally accepted or received well. There was certainly critique, you know, the usual stuff. It's corrupting the youths and the women and the working classes. They should be reading theological tracts, or not reading at all. They should just be working. But yes, they were very popular. I think Penny Dreadfuls are a really good example of that, that they, you know, were wildly successful in terms of how many were sold and how popular they were. That's why you've got something like Barney the Vampire going on for 667,000 words, which is just amazing. Yeah, Poe had issues with criticism, definitely. I mean, it's sort of a constant of Gothic literature, I find. I mean, you find it even today, don't you, with the hot takes on horror. Yes, getting paid by the word does help. Particularly problematic for Dickens, I feel like. He could never quite restrain himself. Wish I got paid by the word. I could definitely rake it in. Any more questions before we head up the last beat? So, I mean, obviously that is a very potted summary. We're going over a sort of tracking some trends in the Victorian period, not going into it with lots and lots of detail. We're obviously going to be seeing that more in some of the Sunday Gothic. So, you know, Vernon Lee last week was a really good in-depth investigation of that sort of queer coding of ghostly voices, for example. This may be off the point, but do you know what the view on women reading that kind of thing was? Whether there were different views on different classes of women reading sensation fiction or penny dreadfuls? So the Victorian period is not my era specifically. Certainly, as far as I'm aware, the same panics were continuing from the 18th into the 19th centuries about a female readership. And those were often linked to a sense of lower class women reading as well. So Gothic texts early on were often associated with being the silly novels of servant girls, and were dismissed both by class and gender. Yay! So, yes. Basically, there was this concern. Are there any particular Gothic works that reflect any discomfort with a woman being on the British throne for so long? It's an interesting question. Not my area, so I would have to go away and think about it. I mean, arguably She is a little bit like that, if you think about it. It's 2,000 years on a throne. Monstrous. Not sure. I know in the Regency it was frowned upon as common by the upper classes, but it did not stop women from reading them. Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, it's the same now. It's like, you know, people can tell you to your face 1,000 times, don't read romance, it's for stupid people. You're like, no, you're just wrong. It's fun. Get away from me. It's enjoyable and good, and this is a good book. You know, I think it's the same thing to me. Obviously, there's issues of parental control, etc., but similar to now. Poe is a critic himself, yes. If there are any other questions regarding this lesson, is it all right to send them by email? Yeah, totally. That is completely fine. You can contact me by email or on the Twitter if you have any more questions. There's a couple of steampunk novels where Victoria is some kind of cyborg or monster. Oh, yes. I am reading a steampunk series at the moment where Victoria is monstrous. What is it called? I do not remember. The Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences, is it? Might be. Yeah, I'm not sure about the Victorian ones. I know Dracula's a thing to read sometime. Okay, I will. Not sure how historically accurate it is, but there's a really fun historical romance novel called The Lady and the Highwayman about a female penny dreadful author who has to hide her identity for fear of it being viewed as not a respectable pursuit. Yeah, probably. There is also a Barbara Cartland called The Lady and the Highwayman, which was made into a film with Hugh Grant on YouTube. Worth it. A really good Victorian horror is Amnesia. Machine for pigs, lots of class struggle awareness and otherworldly horror. That sounds really interesting. I'm into that. Thank you for all of these. Carringer and Soulless. I'm going to start reading the comments for now and get into the final section. So I've got 10 minutes. I managed to do it in 10 this morning. Can I do it again? We will see. But if I do go over, do feel free. Obviously, I understand if people have to leave, but you're very welcome to stay with me. As usual, I've booked an extra 15 minutes so that we can have a chat. Oh my God, Neil Gaiman's written a story of Victoria's a Lovecraftian old god. I love it. What's the name of it? Can you pop it in the comments while I start sharing my screen? Okay, so 20th century. Now, the 20th century is so broad and so wide that I'm just doing a very small introduction to some of the paths we can see the Gothic taking. The first thing I want to talk about is weird fiction, in part because we're also finding that in the late 1890s, for example, and arguably earlier. So often our conception of weird fiction is dominated by the cosmic horror that Lovecraft defines in his supernatural horror in literature. So he suggests that the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer, unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. So dramatic. But certainly this idea of a cosmic horror, which came to the fore, a An investigation of supernatural occurrences or occurrences which do not fit within the realms of understanding that we have, whether those are the rules of nature or the religious laws and conceptions of the universe, which would explain particular supernatural presences. Weird fiction deals with that which goes beyond and shatters often our understanding of the world in the terms of cosmic horror. So it often also blurs fantasy, science fiction, and horror. So we're already seeing the interconnection of these genres at this point. So 3 examples of this sort of classic weird fiction and cosmic horror. You have Lovecraft's Whisper in Darkness, first published 1930 in Weird Tales, I believe. This is a tale of monstrous cosmic others, brains in jars, etc. The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, published in 1890 in The Whirlwind. So Arthur Machen was inspired by a Welsh temple site, and this is a story of gods and beings, demonic or otherwise, beyond our Christian framework of understanding. The last picture is Algernon Blackwood's The Willows. Algernon Blackwood is probably my favourite of these writers, if I'm honest. I think he has a much lighter hand. He doesn't tell you that it's inexplicable or it goes beyond our understanding. He just shows you that it does. He just shows the boundaries of where our knowledge stops, which I think is more effective for me than telling me 500 times, I couldn't explain it, as Lovecraft does. Sorry, Lovecraft. But in The Willows, it's a sort of eco-Gothic horror, which is also sort of an interesting point to raise there. Yes, I was going to say, obviously, if you're going to talk about Lovecraft, it's worth noting that often much of his work is underpinned by serious issues with racism and homophobia, etc. But what I'm using him to demonstrate here is cosmic horror. Now, my thinking about the weird has changed somewhat after our book club on the women's weird, which many of you came to. And this particular conception that the weird is not limited to cosmic horror. So in this collection, there are a number of stories by writers like Edith Nesbit, Edith Wharton, Mary Cholmondeley, which discuss the weird as a little bit less cosmic, or it can be less cosmic, but in which we find examples of the supernatural which don't fit within normal parameters of explanation, but which are often used to encode arguably particularly female concerns, but certainly fears about things such as the domestic space and domesticity, entrapment, etc. Not always. So some of the aspects, some of the features of the stories in this collection particularly are evil saucepans. Doesn't sound like it can be true, but it is. Proliferating gloves that magically appear, and then petticoats that try and kill people. Nightmare wisteria, gripping people in its feathery clasp. Seeking shadows just outside the corner of your eye. The Shadow by Edith Nesbit, very much recommend. Prehistoric men being found in the sea, vengeful feather boas. Disembodied hands strangling people in the night. Reimagined hells and demonic books. So a wide variety of the supernatural, which is used to interrogate not only sort of female concerns or the domestic space, but a variety of different sort of philosophical standpoints and understandings of the world. So that's weird fiction. Another sort of key feature of sort of the 20th century Gothic and how we're relating it back to the 19th century is this rewriting and reimagining of the Brontës. Now, people asked me in the first session as well about things like Angela Carter. And yes, I think there's a similar desire to rewrite, often from a feminist lens or a decolonized lens or a post-colonialist lens, perhaps better, these existing texts to uncover their truly Gothic hearts. So in Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, we have a reimagining of the Jane Eyre story, reimagining of its dark heart, where it's a lot bleaker than Jane Eyre is. When we marry the master of the house, that the house is haunted not only by a previous wife, but by your husband's own monstrosity, arguably. And there's certainly a significantly bleaker conclusion to the story for the unnamed narrator. There's also a sense in which the Gothic is taken up and adapted, particularly in this example here, to give voices to those that have been othered in text. So very literally, we find this in Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a story of Bertha, Rochester's first wife. And we'll certainly see that a lot in the 20th century, where Gothic and horror modes are used to express different realities of marginalized voices. We saw that already with Vernon Lee last week, where there is an intersection of the queer and the Gothic, and particularly encoding queer desires and queer transgression. We also see the use of the Gothic, the supernatural, etc., in texts like Beloved by Toni Morrison to discuss the traumatic past and current reality. So going back to Rebecca, we also see in the 1940s the rise of the paranoid women's film, which features a paranoid woman. Usually the sense of a house, entrapment within a house space or a domestic space, and the threat, which often comes from the male protagonist. Another famous example, of course, is Gaslight. We also see this reimagining of the Brontës in a more positive sense, perhaps, in the Gothics, the Gothic romance. Now, you'll know if you've ever heard me talk about anything, that I don't agree with the idea of a Gothic romance. And the idea that every Gothic romance is a rewriting of Jane Eyre is just frankly ridiculous and false. There's a lot of variety within the Gothic romance. But having said that, there is certainly a very strong influence of the Brontës, but where we're getting in a number of the texts. So I've given a couple of examples here, but in each of them we are finding some ways in which they resist a sense of a very formulaic recipe for the Gothic of a 19th century setting with a dark, mysterious, lowering man and a virtuous heroine entering a new space. The Mistress of Mellin there, Victoria Holt, is often sort of it's suggested that that was really the start of the rise of the Gothics, the particular proliferation of them and their popularization. Of course, Gothic romance has existed before and after this. Phyllis Whitney is another writer who is very prolific and very famous, and is an interesting point of contrast, because whereas Victoria Holt set most of her stories in the 18th or 19th century, often in sort of wild British locations, Phyllis A. Whitney sets many of hers in America or other countries, often more modern settings, and often with more of an emphasis on female employment and self-autonomy. The Master of Black Tower by Barbara Michaels is a classic there. I love the cover, so I had to include it. It's a tale of Scotland, and is a fairly standard tale of entering a space ruled by a dark, monstrous-esque man. Susan Claudy, The Madness at the Castle, I had to include because it's got one of my favourite little moments of a Gothic novel in it, in that it's set in California, I think, but you have to have a castle. So they literally move a castle stone by stone from England or Europe more broadly to California and pop it on top of a hill. There you go. And A Bride for Bedivere is another interesting text that has a working class hero. So again, sort of moving away from that assumption of an aristocratic hero within these texts. Something that's worth noting is that many of these are pseudonyms, and Hilary Ford, for example, is a man writing under a woman's name, and we find that very, very frequently within the Gothic romance. So sort of a swap on what happened with the Brontës, who were obviously using male pseudonyms to publish. Now, one of my main bugbears is this idea that the only intersection of the Gothic and the Romance is in the Gothics, and particularly within a very narrative conception of what the Gothics are. What we find are multiple sort of overlaps between the Gothic and Romance in other genres. So we have the Austen-esque Gothic, often set in the Regency period. I think Hare is quite a good example of this a number of times, where you are as in Northanger Abbey, producing a fairly light parody, but uncovering a Gothic world underneath, such as the murder attempt against the protagonist. There's also the working woman's romance. I've given an example there from Christine Marion Fraser, Noble Seed. These are often incredibly Gothic historical worlds where not only the threat, but the reality of poverty, destitution, rape, kidnap, etc., have to be confronted by the heroine, who doesn't only escape it, but survives it. Also, we definitely see with the Gothic romance an evolution in terms of where it goes, in terms of what its interests are, fitting and meeting the demands of the public. So obviously one of the most interesting ways for me is that we have the queering of the Gothic romance. Now, a quick content warning about my discussion of this: it's going to include incest, paedophilia, and rape. So if you do not wish to hear about those things, turn off your sound now, and I will wave you back in when I finish talking about them. I'll only be very brief. So in Gaywick, it's a gay rewriting, basically, of a Gothic romance with a Dark Lord and a young, beautiful secretary. But what we find in what starts off as quite a promising rewriting and narrative, which is deconstructing some of the heteronormative dimensions of that relationship, descends into a tale of paedophilic incest and multiple rapes. What I find really interesting about the cover, the second cover there, is there's obviously this quite raunchy look at the text. But what's interesting, if you've read it, is that actually the two protagonists don't have sex. What the young man does is he has sex unknowingly with the protagonist's brother, who also rapes him. So basically, for me, it's quite a dark narrative and quite problematic. And I think that salesmanship is dubious at best. Okay, waving people back in if they've microphoned out. Another way in which this romance developed is, of course, into the paranormal romance through particularly the popularity of Barnabas Collins and Dark Shadows. This really changed the game to some extent. It was obviously a TV series where a vampiric character was introduced, Barnabas Collins, and who became really a protagonist of the show. There was a number of tie-in novels that were created, and we see this proliferation of vampiric figures in romance. You're obviously then going through the 70s, through Anne Rice and this creation of genderqueer and sexuality queer vampires. And then the proliferation of paranormal romance that we find today, everything from the super masculinist vampires of the J.R.R. Ward Black Dagger Brother series through shifter fic, mermaid fic, werewolf fic, pack fic, all sorts of things. There's a very vast proliferation there going on. I'm not a horror scholar, and there is so much to be said about horror and its development in the 20th century that I cannot cover it. I simply can't. We're going to be having some people coming in to chat to us about horror and horror film. But something that's worth noting, I think, is this interrelation. So we often, in some discussions, we differentiate between Gothic and horror quite usefully, but it's also worth noting this interconnection and this development of horror from Gothic quite obviously. So on the left, I have the Hammer horrors, which were more obviously Gothic in nature based on the aesthetic. They're usually using Gothic source material. And then the way in which horror has developed in so many different directions in the 20th century, from the sort of the zombie movies and the creature features, through to slasher fics and torture porn, the demonic narratives and supernatural narratives such as Paranormal, etc. And obviously as well, the sort of the dark serial killer horror narratives. So we have this move from Gothic to horror, but also from horror to Gothic. And we are seeing arguably a resurgence, particularly in Gothic film at the moment. Not just the Gothic as influencing and informing the genre, but as being deliberately evoked, particularly in the work of Guillermo del Toro, of course, Crimson Peak, The Shape of Water, but also in that the Ford Coppola's Dracula. And what part of the difference is, I think, for me, is often many differences, but partly aesthetic, but also partly this balance that you find in the Gothic between fear and desire. So this is my last slide, fear not. This is just a sort of dip in the ocean of the way in which the Gothic has just exploded in the current period. And there's so many manifestations of it mixed up with other genres as a mode from which other genres borrow, text which are produced as Gothic. We have video games, we have podcasts, parodies, pastiches, reinventions, tourism. So there's various examples here. The Monsters obviously is a form of sort of Gothic pastiche with all of these different characters. Return to Ravenhurst, a hidden objects game which uses this Gothic setting. TV shows like Penny Dreadful, Pendulum Sun, which we read this week, which is a very knowing engagement, intertextual engagement with previous Gothic examples. We get the Gothic popping up in sci-fi for Doctor Who, The Weeping Angels. We have podcasts like the Magnus Archive, fighting fantasy games like Vault of the Vampire and Hell House, figures like Elvira, and these modern sort of investigations of the supernatural such as BuzzFeed Unsolved. What we continue to find is the Gothic, the supernatural, and the horror is intertwined through so much of the media that we engage with today. It will not die. It lives on. So enter the wilderness of doubt with me, or the wonderful land of the Gothic. Oops, no, I didn't want to do that. Wanted to do this. Okay, so I didn't make it at all. I'm so sorry that I went over. But so if you have to leave, please do feel free to do so. If you don't have to leave, I am very happy to stick around for as many questions as you have. So do pop them down there. Yes, it was Wide Sargasso Sea. My absolute pleasure as usual. As usual. Oh my gosh. I'll just pop my Ko-fi link there in the bottom as well, just in case. As I say, yeah, if anybody has any questions, that would be great. I love Barbara Michaels as well. And yes, Jane Slayer is a really funny take on Jane Eyre. Recommend. One of my favorite manifestations of the modern Gothic is like the quirk classic mashups. I do really enjoy them. Somewhat paralleled to your description of Australian Gothic, there's a horror film called The Wind that is set in the settler era American plains that pulls its foreboding from huge empty spaces. Yes, so that's something as well that we talked about this morning, that the horror of the unknown and the open space is particularly sort of a feature of these frontier Gothics that you find in both the Australian Gothic and the American Gothic from the sort of settler perspective. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, as I say, you know, like we all have our areas of expertise. So I have a conception of the deployment of the Gothic up to the current day, but hopefully like what I can mostly offer is that really in-depth kind of introduction to the beginnings of it, with some overview. Do you see the move from horror to Gothic today more in the look and tone of a film rather than, the material, or a bit of both? For me, I think it's a bit of both. I think that there's definitely a temptation to view it aesthetically or visually. And I don't think that is the way forward. I think that is quite a limiting way of looking at the Gothic and how it features. But I think what we find in Gothic horror, for me, is an investigation of the liminal space, an investigation of the transgressive space, and a mixture of fear and desire. It's not so horror is about escaping the horrendous, whereas the Gothic for me is about confronting the temptation of the darkness to some extent. So I mean, you certainly see that in films like Crimson Peak, where what's really at stake is this relationship to that temptation and darkness. Yeah, I mean, like Coppola's does feel more Gothic. There's definitely an aesthetic element to it. You know, like I don't want to dismiss that. There is sort of a particular creation of an aesthetic, but it's interesting to note whether the aesthetic itself is Gothic by very virtue of its essence, or if what happens to some extent is that those particular aesthetic techniques and tropes have become encoded with so much particular meaning that they introduce the Gothic into the text. But I feel that sort of the Baroque almost of Coppola's Dracula is part of that Gothic aspect, but it's this celebration not just of horror, but of, I mean, obviously, you know, like love never dies in the Coppola Dracula, but it's this sort of celebration of that dark transgression as well. Do you think the relatively newer mediums, audio dramas, video games, etc., change the ways that we can engage with the Gothic outside of the written word? I mean, there's a whole thing to be said, I think, about the interactive Gothic, which I'm not an expert in. I know quite a few scholars who work on Gothic video games and the ludic Gothic, and so I will not do justice to their work at all right now. But I think inevitably, when you become a part of that Gothic world who is active within it and has sort of subjectivity and agency, then it inevitably changed the ways in which we interact with the texts. So yes, I think audio dramas, I'm not as sure because I haven't thought about it as much. For me, the audio drama is sort of a mix between the traditional ghost storytelling and a TV series in terms of, like, you've got the serial aspect, but you've also got this sort of engagement in a community listening activity. But I would have to think about it a lot more to theorize that well, definitely. But I think, you know, newer mediums are always producing new and interesting ways in which we can reimagine the Gothic as well, and reimagine what these things mean to us, how they function to us. I think Bloodborne is a really good example, actually, of this sort of the way in which the video game and Gothic interacts in terms of the role that it places you in and your realization about your place in that world as you continue with the game, and the sort of narratives of transgression, agency, responsibility, etc., that it forces upon you, or that it forces you to engage with. There's a new version of Creepshow out, and a story this past week was very Gothic to me rather than the horror of the finger. I've not seen it, so I'm not really sure. I think for me, because I'm a Gothicist, I'm just like, everything is Gothic. And that's what I sort of continually see is Gothic-ness rather than horror. But that's probably my terribleness. But I know that, I don't know if, yes, Morbido Trailers is going to be talking to us about horror, I think, right? So Abraham, yeah, I can't hear you.
Mummies.
But you're a horror. Mummies. You're a horror
yes.
person, aren't you? So hopefully, I mean, like, I'm just throwing you in the deep end there. When you're doing your talk, if you have horror questions, store them up. Store them up, for people who will have better ideas than me. The way that Coppola's Dracula was shot, yes, was directly intended to evoke the changing technology of the time of the novel. Yeah. I mean, that's something that I talked about in the beginning. There's a certain, like, neo-Victorianism to how we conceive of the Gothic aesthetic. And I think that, yeah, it's useless to try and deny that. Does the Gothic need to necessarily take place in our world? I was just thinking about how many of the tropes Skyrim has, for example. No, I don't personally think that it does have to take place in our world. I think you can definitely see the deployment of Gothic tropes in other worlds and universes, in science fiction and fantasy, for example. I would say that what you're getting is an engagement with the Gothic mode. It's not Gothic per se. You know, I feel like putting a stamp of Gothic on anything diminishes the sort of the truth of the way in which genres interact with each other and use sort of aspects of different modes together. But yes, I think, like, when we read Pendulum Sun this week, and I think that's a really interesting example, because obviously it's adjacent to our real world, but you never see the real world. You just see this fairyland, and it is a quite evidently Gothic space, even though it's a completely invented world. So I think that's quite a good example of the Gothic other world. Along with the Machine for Pigs Victorian Gothic game, they did another game that takes place around the 1830s called The Dark Descent. Even if you don't play games, the story and atmosphere is very Gothic in a traditional horror sense. That sounds good. Yeah, thank you. I've got to go. Bye, Julia. My pleasure for the lecture. I hope people enjoyed it. It was vast today. Vast. It's what happens when I move out of my lane. But is that a hand up, Heidi, or like I don't know what they mean. If they're like a sort of like high five through the screen, or I don't know. It's really difficult to interpret, isn't it? Need to fly. Thank you very much for coming. I will see you again later.
Hi everyone.
Do feel free if you have to leave to leave. But yeah, feel free to stay, ask questions, what else really. I'm always interested to hear from people, you know, if you are if you want to share some of like your ideas, if you're like, oh no, Sam, no. This is my area of expertise, allow me to correct you, then do feel free. I mean, nicely, don't be like, you're an idiot. But do feel free to add anything that you want, if you've got stuff to add. Oh, thank you, Helen and Andrew. That's very nice. Oh, thank you, guys. Hopefully I'll see some people tomorrow for Twilight. I'm excited about the Twilight ones. I also need to go. That was great. Oh, thank you. Thank you for coming. Oh, yes, the publishing houses. I didn't know if it was you or somebody else who'd asked me about them, but people kept asking, so I was like, fine, I'm going to do it. I'm going to dive in and talk a little bit about publishing as well. Fascinated by the relationship of penny dreadfuls to the emerging media in the late Victorian era. Yeah. The sensational headlines surrounding the Whitechapel murders, for instance. Yes. I mean, it is fascinating. I think this really interesting sort of factionalization. So where there's this bleed between fact and fiction, and then this sort of engagement with real life as sensation, but also sort of you see it as well in the 18th century from a ghost perspective. So you have these manuals, or you have these collections of ghost stories, you have these shared ghost narratives, and what is occurring, I think, in a way is quite similar in terms of this bleeding between these fictional recreations and this factual. So you're getting this kind of factional engagement. Not that the Jack the Ripper details were factional, but that the engagement with them is as though it's sort of a sensationalized fiction in a sense. Yeah, sensationalism in news never went away. Never, was always here, really. I feel like penny dreadfuls were early comics. Yes, I totally agree. They basically were. I would not have held on for the whole of Varney the Vampire, I don't think. Can you imagine? Oh my God, like 3 years later. No. Maybe it's actually the only way to read it, to be fair. I never managed to get through the whole book. You mentioned secret societies in part 1. Do you think there's a link between the Gothic and the modern subgenre of dark academia? Ooh, thinking about Ninth House in particular, which has a supernatural element. I do not know Ninth House. But yeah, I mean, I think that with a lot of these tropes, they get updated and reimagined for new situations. So the secret society becomes, you know, dark academia. I have a professor who'd read all of Varney, and we were all in awe of him. He was very committed to vampires. Yes. I feel like a bad goth, but every time I look at it, I just lose the will to read, you know? Like it's so unwieldy as well. It's like this big. How are you meant to read that? You're just like, ugh. It's a Wordsworth edition as well, so you know the spine is going to go after like 5 whole seconds. Just flopping around. Yeah. Secret History. I've also not read Secret History. Terrible, isn't it? It's recommended to me when I was in high school. Never read it. Tut, tut, tut. Tut upon me. Oh, true. I mean, I'm sure I have read things that long. I've read like War and Peace and stuff, but I don't know. It's just like the dauntingness of it. When you see it all in one, I think that's the issue. Fanfic's easy to read because you're like, I just read a little bit more. My copy of The Moonstone just came in the mail. Yes, another tome. Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. I'm very jealous. I have a rubbish Wordsworth copy of The Moonstone. Leave it in the bathroom and read it in tiny shit. That is how I have been dealing with Dante for the past 4 years. I mean, I made it through the Inferno and Purgatory quite well, and then I got stuck in heaven because it is so dull. Oh my gosh. Yes. Yeah, sorry. There's too much detail in my reading habits there for you guys. Sorry about that. Yes, does anyone have any more questions? Adiós, and no sé si te voy a ver la semana que viene, pero sí, bye bye. Perfecto. Yields. Connected to the Moonstone, Druid is wild. Yes. I mean, there's so much wild stuff going on in the Victorian Gothic. Love it. I mean, I was recommending The Beetle this morning. If you've not read The Beetle, worth a read. Just all over the place. Amazing. I mean, I think I find that with a lot of Gothics. Like, I keep recommending Ethelwina. Like, I don't know if this is a selling point to you, but at one point the villain uses the heroine as a human shield by hanging her over the castle battlements to defend against a siege. What is that? Amazing is what that is. Anyway, you see, it is a selling point, right? Is she made out of animal? No, she's just made out of human flesh, but the weapons are so inaccurate that they can't then fire at the castle because they might accidentally kill her, is basically the plot. And there's only one entrance to the castle, so they can't like go around and just hit the back, you know? But I love it. Okay, anybody else got a question? Going to reread. Oh, I didn't mention Dennis Wheatley. Oh, good point. Yes, Dennis Wheatley and satanic sort of panic literature of a sort. Satanic literature, anti-communist satanic literature. Yeah. Christopher Lee, he was a fan of Dennis Wheatley. There you go. Yeah, anybody got any more questions or thoughts before I go? No? Thank you so much for coming. It was so nice to see so many people, and thank you for putting up with it running a bit late. Thank you again. Oh, that's why you did The Devil Rides Out. That makes sense. My pleasure. And I will hopefully see you again in a couple of weeks. I think a couple of you are coming next week. I'm not sure. If you don't speak Spanish, I wouldn't bother because it's all in Spanish. But we'll still be having the Sunday Gothics, of course, next week. And then you've got a double whammy of me because I timed it incredibly badly, doing a lecture on the Saturday and the Sunday. Genius. So yes, look forward to that. Anyway, hopefully I will see you during the week. Might see you tomorrow. And I will, see you around, guys. Bye.